There's a book that I often will reference called Gangs and Counter Gangs, and it was written by Frank Kitson, who was a British intelligence officer in Kenya during
Mhm.
the Land and Freedom Uprising, the Maumau Uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, where the people of Kenya fought against British colonialism. In
Yeah.
order to defeat the uprising, the British started hiring Africans uh, who were former Mau Mau fighters and others, and sending them out as what they called counter gangs to gather information, to pose as Mau Mau and commit atrocities that would be blamed on the Mau Mau. That would, in addition to that, they would confuse the population. People didn't know who the real Mau Mau fighters were and who were the ones paid by the British, who were the so-called counter gangs, and they created so much confusion they were able to ultimately defeat the uprising. Now, there's a really good book called Imperial Reckoning that talks about how a lot of what the British did was they just rounded up all the men and held them in these kind of mini concentration camps. That was a big part of the victory as well. But the use of counter gangs, were like insurgent fighters of their own to defeat an insurgency and to confuse the populations. The population couldn't tell who the real insurgents were. That became like a staple of counterinsurgency operations. Frank Kitson was heavily involved in the British fight in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, the Troubles. That, if you read what's been written about insurgencies, counterinsurgency warfare, etc., that tactic of cultivating extremists or fighters of your own as a way of muddying the water and confusing things. That's been kind of a key way the United States has waged counterinsurgencies around the world, and cultivating these kind of proxy forces like Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, like the various terrorist groups in Syria that have successfully overthrown the Syrian government. That's an effective way of kind of confusing people, right? The USA was defeated in Vietnam because it was pretty clear it was the Vietnamese people versus the foreign occupier, and that's how the United States was able to lose. But in the aftermath of the U.S. losing the Vietnam War, U.S. foreign policy was kind of restructured, and with the rise of Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, with the Trilateral Commission, the focus kind of became more on how do we muddy the waters of these national liberation movements? How do we muddy the waters of these situations so it's not so clear who's on what side? So there are different forces contending for power. We back some sometimes, we back some the other times. Zbigniew Brzezinski, he wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he said the strategy is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. And if you look at what the USA did after the Vietnam War, like, for example, there was a war in the 1980s, the Iraq-Iran War, and the USA was on both sides of it at various times. At the beginning, they were supporting Iraq against Iran. Later, towards the end of the war, they were supporting Iran against Iraq. But they really saw both countries, both Ba'athist Arab socialism in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and the Islamic Revolution of Iran, they saw them both as a threat. And they were both anti-colonial, anti-imperialist forces. But it was, how do we manipulate them against each other? How do we draw a river of blood between Arab nationalists and Islamic Shia revolutionary forces, make sure they would never work with each other? How do we manipulate those forces? This is ultimately how the USA has been successful in defeating anti-colonial uprisings, how the USA kind of won the Cold War. So what you were describing there with the fact that they're now using, these extremist forces in Burkina Faso to target, the revolutionary government of Ibrahim Traoré, that's not at all new or surprising. You look to Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram, which now calls itself ISIS in Africa, which is basically sponsored by the local level of the Nigerian government in Muslim regions. But yet the USA has used Boko Haram as an excuse to increase its military presence in Africa. There's that whole bring back our girls thing that was, Michelle Obama and others were pushing. But basically the Nigerian government and Saudi Arabia have ties to this, terrorist group in Nigeria that then the USA is able to use to send its military, into Africa and expand its military presence. That that went on, and then there is a group in Nigeria called the Islamic Movement in Nigeria that are Shia Muslims that have been trying to bring Christians and Muslims in Nigeria together. And you'll notice the USA backed the Nigerian government in brutally repressing them. And Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki was detained and held by the Nigerian military for years without charges. Their compounds were forcibly broken up. So Boko Haram, expands in the Islamic regions. There's tension between Christians and Muslims, but then you have an actual anti-imperialist force in the country that gets very heavily suppressed. And that, there are people that were in Guantanamo Bay for years that are now in the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And you have to ask what went on all those years they were sitting in Guantanamo Bay. The USA was, at least U.S. officials, intelligence was learning to push their buttons, learning to manipulate them. The Taliban, the Al Qaeda, those kind of forces in Afghanistan were already kind of used by the USA as proxies to fight against the Soviet Union. And so then you have their leaders sitting in a prison, for years, an isolated prison, a prison where there's no record, right? They're not as official prisoners, but they're subject to whatever was going on in Guantanamo Bay. And then they're released, and then they're in the government of Afghanistan. Well, that's years the USA has had to study them and learn how they operate, and who knows what kind of weird psychological experiments and mind control was done to them. And now they're the government of Afghanistan. So you have to look at all of this, and the cultivation of extremist forces to confuse things, to make it so anti-colonial fights are not clear. That's generally how the imperialists have been operating.